we try to start every one of these years, kind of a reset. We get down in the weeds sometimes near the end of the year. We start talking about all of the clouds and containers and microservices and Kubernetes, because why not just have some sort of obscure Greek words, because that'll make our lives way easier, right? So I feel like we go down that rabbit hole every year, and every year, January, we start over and we think, wait, why are we deving some ops? What are we actually trying to accomplish? And how do we make these changes inside our organization? If you're in, I would just love to see a show of hands. Are you in what you would consider to be a large organization? And that's at least half the room. So if you're in a smaller organization, congratulations, might be easy. If you're not, wow, you have a lot that you might have to do, and you might wonder how. So I am very happy to welcome today's speaker, who is going to plug her laptop in, and that'll be a whole thing. But the reason that I wanted Heather to come talk to you, and some of you, I would love to see a show of hands of how many of you have been to DevOps Days Minneapolis. All right, so those of you who have been to DevOps Days Minneapolis, it's possible you may have picked up your badge. You may have, I'm not sure why we have music again, but I like it, let's go with it. Hey. You may have picked up your badge. You may have seen Heather solving all of the problems at registration. And you may think, hey, wait, our registration is also handled by DevOps? Answer is, this is a great community full of people who have been doing this stuff for a while and who have a lot of ideas to impart. And the reason I asked Heather to come talk to you is because I think there's something to be said for social proof. The idea that, and don't forget to turn your mic on, the idea that when you go back to the office tomorrow and you're all fired up with the exciting things you want to do at your organization, when you can talk about who this person is, who had these thoughts, who had these ideas, people say, oh, okay, and she does what? And she works where? Okay, we're going to listen to these ideas. And then you get your way. So, all right, so give it up for Heather McMahon.
Thank you. And can everybody hear me okay? I didn't do a test of the mic, but can those in the back, you can hear me? Not so much? So? Okay. If you need it louder in the back, maybe just go like this, and I'll then try and talk up my mic. I can often be a soft talker, especially when I start to get, I don't know. I have a tendency to talk very quickly, and then my voice starts to lower, and I don't know. It's a thing for me. So anyways, good evening. Thank you, Bridget, for the nice introduction. So I'm Heather McMahon. I'm really excited to be here tonight to, as Bridget said, kind of do some DevOps 101. So I'll share my perspective on how to approach a transformative DevOps journey within large organizations. I'll talk about modernizing our architectures, different things that we need to consider, and just describe some practical considerations when starting a DevOps journey and shifting to those modern architectures. So first, just a little bit about me. So as I mentioned, I'm a VP at Optum Tech, and I've been there for about 9 months. So I'm still relatively new in the healthcare industry and working at Optum Tech. And one thing I didn't know, and I really want to put a plug in here for Optum Tech, I didn't know until I actually started there that it's the world's largest IT shop in healthcare. It's a massive, massive IT organization. And then prior to that, I was at Target for many, many years. And my day job has never actually had anything to do with DevOps or driving DevOps transformations, but I have viewed it as being very critical to the success for my team and the work and the agendas that we were pushing, and so hence that's kind of my interest and passion on the topics. I gave my first talk on DevOps and driving a transformation within a large IT organization back in 2014 at the first Minneapolis DevOps Days concert. It was kind of like a concert. It was amazing. But no, the conference. And I'm now one of the organizers of the event because I found it incredibly, incredibly useful and insightful to, well, one, to share my story and then kind of hear feedback from others, and then learn from other organizations that were going through or thinking about starting similar journeys. And also just another plug, so thank you to SPS for sponsoring these events and for Bridget for continuing to organize and pull this community together. I think it's super important and just speaks tremendously about the fantastic tech scene that we have here in the Twin Cities. All right, so DevOps transformation, unlock your data, platform, and culture. All three of those things I have a ton of passion about. So hopefully we'll have some good conversations as I talk through this. So first, and also worth mentioning, I say that I'm kind of a babbler, and so I can start telling stories, and next thing you know, it's like 8 o'clock at night. So I'm going to try really hard not to do that. And I'm condensing kind of a long talk into 30 minutes. And the reason I wanted to do that, though, is because this is a really good talk to talk on and highlight a number of different themes that folks talk about when we're shifting into DevOps and modernizing our architectures. And so I won't go very deep, but I'm happy to afterwards, or you can ping me later to talk deeper on any of these concepts and hopefully just get the conversation going. So when I first started becoming engaged in the DevOps community about 5 years or so ago, I was amazed at the similarity of the stories across different organizations. Like the common themes and threads that I would hear were just like, and have these like, oh my God, really? Like you have to deal with that too? You're dealing with that? And then that, so, oh, that happened to me too, right? And so as well, I think this is a great way for us to start the conversation and start our year in 2018. Okay, so I will spend a few minutes here. I'm not going to dwell on a ton of these kind of context and where we're starting from, but I do think it's important to level set on kind of where we're starting. Right, so many of us waterfall factory delivery, and that's because that's how we delivered software and systems for decades, right? That's how I kind of grew up early in my career many years ago, a couple decades ago, being taught these different kind of methodologies and processes around how we build systems. We also often tend to have big organizational silos, right? The two kind of obvious ones to highlight, dev and ops, but we have many silos across our large IT organizations, even within small IT organizations, and then even within teams. I was talking with a couple of folks today just at work, and it was fascinating to say, you know, we're working with this team. It's maybe 100 different people, and everyone has something that they're specializing in. They don't kind of, you know, where there's silos within even particular teams. We have slow deployment cycles because we tend to have really heavy processes and things like change review boards, manual deployment checklists, you know, and again, that kind of adds, in addition to that waterfall methodology, that really adds to slow deployment cycles. But we intentionally built those processes, right? I mean, I can say even myself, if I rewind 10 years ago, I can remember manual deployment checklists because we were working across all these 15 different teams that came together, and like, here's the 300 steps that we execute on as we go through our quarterly release. And then of course the release goes in, all hell breaks loose for, you know, a couple days, if you're lucky, probably a week as you try and stabilize your systems. And then we also tend to have a lot of tech debt that's piled up over the years, including outdated development tooling, because we haven't really been, you know, many organizations haven't been focused on how do we make the life of our engineers easier. And most organizations as well tend to have a hard time talking with the business teams and finance folks about prioritizing getting rid of tech debt. Right, sometimes hard to help your business partners understand the impact of what that means and the work that the team's going through just to keep our systems up and running. And specifically, right, as I think about some of the reasons why we end up here, it's because often our technology work was funded through projects, right? And so really hard to get your business team to be like, yes, you know what we're going to do? It's going to be really sexy for a couple $1 million. We have a whole bunch of tech debt we're going to take care of. Like, that's a hard conversation often to have. You know, as we start to shift our conversations from projects into products, like, it becomes a lot more natural as we're bringing our business partners along in terms of what we need to fund and what's important. And this, for anybody that knows me, like, of course, it's no surprise I'm going to have something about data on here and locked data, because that's kind of my bread and butter and where I spend a lot of my time. And in my experience, having locked data is really one of the toughest challenges to tackle, and I see it everywhere. especially for any organization that's been around, for more than 10 years, has done any kind of acquisitions. We have important data living across multiple systems, making it really difficult to access it consistently. And as I mentioned, close to my heart, it's a problem I'm currently working on within Optum Tech, and it's incredibly, incredibly hard to unwind. And as well, it was a problem that I was working on tackling 6 years or so ago as well at Target. And a simple example of why is it important if it's not obvious is we just kind of say it like block data is hard. It makes it difficult for us to innovate and build applications. To use this just real simple retail example, of course it's really important in retail when you have brick and mortar stores to understand what's the location of those, of all of those stores. It would take every single team that was building applications that needed to know the location of those stores 4 to 6 months of integration work just to get at that really core kind of simple, important to the business. So unlocking data and making it easily accessible is super important. So all of those things, plus probably many more, we can probably think of other things to put up there, but all of those things ends up leaving us kind of frustrated, right? It's difficult to do our work, it's difficult to get stuff done. So hopefully those kind of where are we starting from resonates with the room. Okay, so with that context, we know we need to change, right? And we know in many of our IT organizations, we need to modernize. So why is that important? I kind of talked through some of these already, but just to explicitly say it. So speed. Organizations need to keep pace with fast-changing business landscapes and a fast-changing technology landscape as well. Time to market and delivering value, we should be measuring that in hours. I mean, some could argue we should be doing it in minutes or seconds. We can just say hours would be a great goal, but certainly not in quarters as we have, over the decades. And that's because it's really hard. We can't define a discrete list of, say, hundreds of different requirements, hand them off to a tech team, and then wait for months, because by the time, whenever the thing is built, the market has changed around us and it's too late. Those requirements are no longer valid. So we need to enable innovation, be able to iterate quickly, to understand what resonates with our customers, right? Quality. Oh, right. Well, of course, I can just talk about myself, right? I have pretty high expectations. If I go to a website and the performance is slow, I'm going to go somewhere else to buy a product. Similarly, if I'm using an app and I'm going to move on. It's too easy in 2018 if we're not providing high quality customer service, we'll lose market share. And lastly, so the war for engineering talent is brutal. I spend a lot of my time kind of working to recruit and attract folks, and it's hard to do. Especially when you're talking about coming into large enterprise IT organizations, because engineers want to work on fun, difficult problems and don't want to have to fight through processes and legacy tooling. I'm just skipping over that one. Okay. So in case those reasons and kind of Heather McMahon's opinions weren't enough to say yes, it's important to start taking DevOps seriously. It's important to start some kind of journey within our organizations. I wanted to pull out and highlight some specific data from the State of DevOps report in 2017. If you ever need good data points to persuade someone within your organization, whether it's a peer or some executives, these reports are tremendously helpful. So shout out to Nicole Foskren, Jez Humble, and Jean Kim for all the hard work that they do to publish these reports every year. So when high-performing DevOps organizations are compared to lower-performing orgs, these numbers, they always blow me away when I see them. So deployments occur 46 times more frequently. We see 440 times faster lead times. The change rate is the change failure rate. Sorry, as I started to say, I was that's not right. The change failure rate is 5 times lower. And then when we do see issues, it's 96 times, organizations will be 96 times faster mean time to recover. It's pretty outstanding. Teams will spend 44% more time on new features as unplanned work and rework decreases by 21%. Okay, so some data points. I'm sure, and many of us are probably here today, we are already probably sold on the fact and the importance of DevOps and why and why a change is needed and important. And so, of course, that sounds great. And of course, we want to do that. But that's kind of the million-dollar question, right? How do you change? And it's a really, really, really daunting task, especially, I think, within the half of us in the room that raised our hands and said, yes, we work at pretty massive organizations. So when I first started approaching this type of change in the shop that I target, when I was there about 6 years or so ago, I wasn't sure how to do it, and to be honest, there wasn't like this multi-year plan that had been laid out, and everyone kind of knew the path forward for here's how we're going to transform kind of a legacy IT organization into a fast-moving software engineering shop. But we did know that we needed to start somewhere, and then we were able to adjust our approach and strategy as the journey kind of revealed itself, and different steps and problems kind of were highlighted along the way. Because in reality, in my opinion, the secret to the success of any transformation is pulling the right people together, prioritizing hard work to show results, and then patience. Continuous improvement and commitment to continuously improve is essential because you're never done. And it really is a journey, and I know I've probably said the word journey 100 times already today, and I will probably continue to say it because it's true, and it's one that we're all on and just continuously trying to get better. Okay, so what could a roadmap for change look like? So let's think about it as kind of two parts of a transformation. The first is going to be how to influence and make progress across the organization. And then, what's the actual work that we need to do? How do you start that work? Because we can talk about it all day long and work to influence across our organization, but unless we demonstrate results, right, there's no point in doing the work. So we need a plan of attack. Three-way, kind of like a three-approach plan that I think about here. So first is unlocking your data, evolving your engineering and removing those roadblocks, and then culture within our organizations and how we structure the work within our teams. So first let's talk about how to influence and start the journey. So as I said, any change requires patience. We're saying any change also requires a lot of persistence. And for anyone in the room that's worked with me before, you know I have a lot of the latter. I'm very persistent. I don't often have a lot of patience, so I am careful to surround myself with people that help kind of balance my approach. And so what I've seen as change has been successful and good journeys have been kicked off at different organizations is that it requires within kind of how we're influencing across the organization 3 different approaches across 3 primary audiences, because we've probably all seen kind of changes that have been started from the grounds up that didn't quite make it, from the tops down, that aren't very successful usually. So we have to balance between those 2 approaches. So first, incubation, or just kind of like our grassroots movement across engineering teams within the organization. And so what this can look like is figuring out a small handful of teams to demonstrate results, to prove the patterns, build the initial pipelines and the initial infrastructure. And so this is finding change agents within the organization. And honestly, it's probably many of us in the room. Change agents aren't hard to spot. They'll have a lot of passion, and they'll be excited to work on something new and to help push a change forward. The early successes, and I think it's really important, these early successes are really important because unless we can demonstrate some kind of results, unless we get something in production and we can show faster deployment cycles, we can show that the reliability of those deployments increase over time and we have less issues. As we start to do that, it becomes a lot easier to sell and influence across the organization. And so, of course, no change gets very far unless there's sponsorship at the executive levels. And so typically this is either going to need to be like our CIO and the leadership team there, or at least a handful of folks that are sitting at the CI leadership table. Because there really is a lot of change that's needed from not only a technology perspective, but a process perspective, as well as from an overall organizational perspective as well. And so getting executive support is really important because that is the part of the organization. Those are the folks that can set an expectation across the organization that teams will be agile, product, DevOps teams, and we can set the organization marching in the right direction, figuring out then within our teams what it is that we need to do to actually change. So then that gets us to the middle. And I've often heard the phrase used kind of like the frozen middle. This is often like the hardest part of the organization. I shouldn't say often. I hear probably time and time again, this is the hardest part of the organization to change. One, it's usually a large group of people. And it's a set of folks like within middle management, right? Like we have been successful for probably a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades, and now we're being asked to change pretty radically in terms of how we do our work and how we approach that work. So it can be really kind of just honestly really scary and like, well, I don't know, you're asking me to completely change the way in which I lead my teams, and can be successful in my job. And so I'm going to use a term, as I was reading the 2017 State of DevOps report, like they use this term in there that I hadn't run across before, and I find it really interesting. They called it transformational leadership. So it's similar to servant leadership. You'll often hear servant leadership described in DevOps communities. Difference though with transformational leadership is leaders are inspiring and motivating their teams to achieve higher performance by working towards common goals and a common vision, values, communication, example setting, so doing the work with the teams, and then caring, that's kind of the servant leadership part, caring about those around them. So let's assume that we have most of these different audiences bought on to the approach and that it's important for us to change and move forward. Hey.
So I think how did you, I guess, pitch to executive leadership that wasn't done? Sometimes it feels like it's like, oh yes, we tried that, but that doesn't work, or we're too complicated.
How about I'll handle questions at the end? I'm taking cues as well. So hold that, and then I've got some ideas.
All right.
So if we have some early successes, let's say we have our senior leaders bought in, some of our middle management, we have to actually scale across the organization and help teams understand how is it that I'm doing my work differently. So time needs to be invested to help make this change happen. A great technique and approach is to actually bring in or develop within your organization agile coaches and tech coaches that can sit with teams in, whether it's 2 sprints, 5 sprints, 6 sprints, sprint 0, let's talk about how to even, what is the backlog, what is the product that we have, but to sit and actually do work with the teams until the teams are able to get up and running and kind of can operate independently. So I think that coaching concept is one that I've seen work really, really well. I also have a personal bias of, I think it's really difficult to go off to a workshop for a week and then come back and try and help, and then try and drive a change there, because the classroom learning can often be really hard, especially when you're changing how you're thinking about your work. Not called out on this slide, but worth mentioning as well, I was just chatting with a couple of folks earlier this evening, is that other parts of the organization needs to be involved as well, as we're talking about scaling broadly across our IT organization. Most importantly, I'd say, is your business teams, right? We need product owners for our tech work. And the more that we have our product owners sitting with our teams and helping to define what's in the backlog, what's in the priorities, understanding what the teams are running into, the more successful that will be. Secondly, I would highlight HR and recruiting. It's incredibly important to help attract and retain good folks on your team, and so bringing them along to help ensure that we have some really good hiring practices in place, really good retention plans in place, and then honestly, when we need support to make changes in our team, if we're not able to kind of shift some people to a new mindset, we need the support there as well. And lastly, I'll highlight finance, and there's other parts of the organization that are important as well, but finance is another critical component So I mentioned before kind of the constraints we run into when we have project-based funding instead of product-based funding. To make that kind of shift, the two big orgs that I've worked in, that is one of the biggest shifts to help change the way that we actually give money to teams and approve money to teams to get the work done. And so bringing finance along and someone that can help sit down and figure out what's our funding model and how do we shift, that's incredibly, incredibly important. So point being on this slide, we need to bring a lot of folks with us on the journey. It's not just an IT journey. And we need to make it fun. Like if we're having these conversations, there's a lot of like intense, hard conversations to be had. And so keeping it fun and making it a journey and having it be, I don't know, like a little bit like an adventure. That sounds a little Pollyanna, sorry, but it's fun and we can have fun when we're doing this, and it makes it a lot easier to bring partners along too if we're not like yelling across the table, but instead kind of working on it as a team effort. Okay, so that's the little bit there about how to influence and think about driving change just from an overall organizational perspective. And now jumping into the plan of attack and how to start approaching that in the actual work. And this might also answer the question about how do you start to get people bought into this. So the data problem is one that can be really, really massive, and orgs can get stuck in analysis paralysis about it, or like trying to solve it. How are we going to unwind all of these hundreds of systems that are, connected like this? It's never going to work. Or we spend months like architecting at the whiteboard this amazing ivory tower architecture, and then we hand it over to the engineering teams, and there's like, no, folks, that's not going to work. So, and I call this out as like the first thing to tackle, because I believe you can't move with the speed or consistency that we need to in 2018 unless our data are well understood and easily accessible. And so this also means kind of a microservices, event-driven kind of architecture, and it requires self-service access to the APIs to get at the data, as well as data streams, assuming we're using data streams in an event-driven architecture. Okay, so if we're going to do this, my recommendation is to centralize the definition of what the data are, and then federate the development of exposing that data out to the owning product teams. And I say product there, kind of highlight that, because if we're in an organization where we don't yet have product teams that are accountable for the data and the systems around that data domain, it's important then to centralize the work until our organizational structure kind of catches up with it. And so one way to do that, right, is so we centralize the work, and a team that's accountable for the initial implementation of the API and streaming infrastructure, as well as the development, or the development work that needs to happen to expose that data. As well, that also often means creating the standards. What are our review processes? What kind of governance do we need to have around that? And a lot of like learning by trying within the organization. And then once we get it kind of understood on a central team, and we start to have product teams build up around the important data domains, we can then federate the ownership out. And the reason I say, so why you need to create a centralized team to do this initially, and I'd say the primary reason that if we're just stepping into a microservices and a streaming architecture, it's really, really easy to run the risk of like a very haphazard approach across a whole different teams, and that gets really messy really, really fast. I'll just say around that. So then, in terms of, so great, so we'll start to do that, we'll centralize the team, now what? We have to prioritize, so what data are most important for us to be successful as an organization? So initially talking about what are the data domains that are important within my organization. It's going to be probably somewhere in the magnitude of like 25 to 50, depending on the industry that you're in or within your organization and how complex it is. And then pick the top 2 to 3. So in retail, that's something like my item data and my store locations data. In healthcare, that's like eligibility data and claims data, right? Like you solve the big 2 or 3, like you've solved a lot of the data that people need access to over and over again. fake it till you make it. So there should be one, so in a magical world, there should be one system of record for each of our core data domains. Kind of one master system that's accountable for simplifying, removing duplication systems of record. And as I say that, I'm like, yes, I would love to live in that magical place, because that sounds, that would make it very easy, right? But it's hard to do, right? It's hard to do with organizations that have been around for a long time because of that spider web that we all know exists out there. And so, right, so what can we do? We kind of fake it till we make it and give ourselves the room to modernize that spider web that's underneath. And so a really nice way to do that, to abstract those multiple backend systems, is to, well, you need some kind of layer, right, to abstract from those backend systems, and data streams are a really nice way to do that, and it gives kind of an insulating layer, for lack of a better term, that you're abstracting from those backend systems, so that we then give our teams the time that they need to kind of modernize and clean up what's been built over time. Modernize, so I just talked about that, right? Like, as we do this, as we unlock our data, as we start to abstract those backends, it gives us the flexibility to modernize. Okay, so second step of our 3-step plan is to evolve our engineering and remove roadblocks. And there are so many aspects, and I'm sure this is what I'm going to get some feedback on afterwards from folks in the room. Why didn't you talk about this? There's so many different aspects of our engineering practices that need to be modernized. I'm picking a few that I think are the first that we start to run into in big organizations. Because I think about this, this part of the evolution of the journey as kind of removing the barriers as we encounter them, the barriers that we run into over the course of building software that sit between us and doing our local dev and pushing that to production, right? And so there's all sorts of things that kind of sit in our way of doing that as we start modernizing how we do our work. One of the first big shifts is to continuous integration. How many, just out of curiosity, how many feel like your organization has totally mastered how you do CI? Okay, so like 4 people, for those in the front row that can't see, like you're half. And so it's hard, like it's hard to, it really is, it's hard to do. It's a big shift to teams that are new to it. And again, if I rewind a few years, as I was working, like the first team that I was working with and we were moving to CI, it took many, many weeks of me saying no to deploying in production until our actual Jenkins build was clean and we were green. And I didn't get in a ton of trouble from our business teams because we're at a point that it was okay to delay a week here, week 2, 3, 4. So it was a harder shift on the actual team and the culture on the team than it was on the business teams. And then of course you get the amazing benefits of, I have a CI pipeline, I can now quickly push changes through, and I can do it really, really reliably as well. So one of the first, in my opinion, the first kind of barriers that you run into. And then infrastructure as code, and then some kind of platform to deploy and on. Because that's it. So infrastructure is a huge barrier. So lots of companies, right, will start to use config management tools. They're using that to manage the state of their infrastructure and deploys. Good, I'm glad you didn't see that. Something exciting just popped up on my screen. Infrastructure as code as platform, right. Sorry, now I have to get my train of thought back. All right, so we're using config management tools to manage the state of our infrastructure and deploys. We start getting really good at deploys because we've mastered CI. Maybe we're talking about doing CD. Now we don't really want to talk about infrastructure anymore, right? Like I just want APIs to my infrastructure. I want infrastructure as a service. And we all know, right, like developers, what we want our developers to do is to develop and build new exciting apps and features and functionality. We want our devs to be able to ship code, not manage infrastructure. So we need some kind of platform to build, deploy, and manage our apps. And now kind of depending on, this conversation I've had hours and hours and hours of debates on. And it's dependent on your organization, if you own data centers, if you don't own data centers, if you're at one public cloud provider or if you're at a couple of cloud providers. So kind of depending on your constraints there, that choice is different. And then of course the way that we build our applications is important as well. We need to build our apps as cloud native apps that are resilient and scalable and performant and all the amazing things that we have there. This as well is often a really new concept and idea within organizations. And so if you haven't read 12factor.net and this is kind of new to you, I highly recommend just going there, using that as a starting point. It's a great just kind of like simple list and things to think through as you're shifting the way that you build software. So I'm going to call out social coding here as well. If this is not how your organization does engineering today, change it. We need to make work visible. Our pull requests are how changes should be reviewed and approved. And I lump in ChatOps here as well because kind of similarly, it's a great way for us, again, to just get visibility of what is going on across our team within the broader ecosystem. You know, we can pipe in important events about what's happening within our ecosystem, alerts or deploys, changes. And it's a great way for teams to catch up when they're working in different time zones or somebody's out for a couple of days and needs to see what's going on with the team. I'm working on this right now with some of the teams that I'm working with now, and it's a big mindset to shift into ChatOps and to even just start using some kind of persistent chat tool. But it's always really fun to see as everyone, as the kind of lights go off and we're like, wow, yeah, this is really fantastic. Our productivity is increasing. Plus then when Heather needs to know what's happening, she can just ask quick in the chat room and we don't have 20 different emails and things going on. Also just, again, you could probably spend hours talking on this topic as well, but measure everything. Observability across our systems is super, super important. And the way that we do that now in 2018 is very different than how we did it, I'd say even 3 years ago, but certainly different than 5 years ago. And so, especially as teams are being kind of brought into modernizing systems and applications, and this is a really important topic to spend some time on and educating, not just running to the tooling is really important to talk about, but just what is it that we're measuring, and then let's talk about the tooling afterwards. Okay, so lastly in plan of attack, culture. We talk a lot about culture in DevOps. Lots of talks at DevOps Days Minneapolis often are about culture and cultures within our organization. Because the reason is simple, I think the reason is simple that we talk so much about it, because with the right culture, kind of anything is possible. I do want to hit on some org considerations and then some specific culture things just really quick. First things first, and again, I think this is important, and I kind of just alluded to it when I said ChatOps, and that I can just ask a quick question to a team about what's going on in production. So it's flat organizations are important because it makes it so easy to communicate from what is it that we're doing from a strategy perspective to what's actually happening in production. And of course, management layers are always required. And so it's less about, it is somewhat about the levels between engineers and the CIO, and the less levels better, because then messaging doesn't get lost as easily. You hear less about, well, I thought the CIO said this. No, I heard this. Well, why are you doing that? I don't know, CIO said so. And so removing those kinds of telephone games is really helpful. Number of layers, of course, depends on the size of your organization. As a rule of thumb, I like to say 15 or so direct reports for engineering managers and engineering directors. Agile product teams should be 2 pizza teams, right? So I can feed the whole team if I get 2 pizzas. And this is important, again, kind of back to that communication things and keeping people in sync. It's a lot easier to move quickly and communicate when you have small teams that understand what is it that we're accountable for, what's the vision of our product, and how is it that we're delivering value to the business. I feel like I've really harped on this, products versus projects. It's a really important shift and one that's really hard to do as well it's difficult to do, right? Our IT organizations have typically centered around projects, but it's really important. So let's say, so if we have a reasonably flat organization, we have agile product teams, we're operating as products and not projects. Now it's very important for us to protect the priorities of the teams. There's nothing worse than like giving it to every 2 weeks or every sprint, like whiplashing teams around with different priorities. And so settling on, kind of here over the course of the next 3 months, these are our priorities, and we're pretty much going to keep that frozen. And then the 3 months after that, like that's a little bit more gray, a little bit more loose, like that's fine, but for sure protect those priorities, especially in the 3 month, in kind of 3 month increments. I really, really hate black and white role definitions. And I hate, like, I kind of get like I vomit a little bit when I hear the word racy. But when making, I think being very specific about roles on teams when making a change is really, really important. So I highlight the roles that are very important on our agile product teams. So of course, engineers, Scrum Master, our product owners, and engineering managers. And again, I would highlight, so very specifically that says roles, not people, because sometimes we will have people playing different roles. Again, it's going to depend on what the team is and how large it is and the size of the product. So passionate learning and innovation. So I don't think I've said this yet, but it's something I really, truly believe in. Leaders must listen to the people closest to the problem. If we have executives telling engineers how to do the work, something is really broken. So as a leader, it's now my job to set strategy, priorities, guardrails, and again, ask what happens in production when production is broken. But that's my job, right? And so unless I am in the day-to-day coding alongside my team and with my engineers, I need to listen to my engineers for the how we're going to do the work. Super important. It also helps to ensure that our teams feel accountable to the work and have a sense of ownership and pride about what it is that they're building. I expect continuous learning from the people I surround myself with, and it's one of the main things that I look for when hiring someone is whether or not they possess this trait. And I think, in 2018, with how quickly technology changes around us, it's less about what technologies do I have on my resume. It's more about how can I shift and how can I pick up new skills. And giving teams the time to innovate and learn is really important. Things as simple as like setting aside 10% maker time, right? So just like 4-hour blocks of time. Not that people are going to use exactly those 4-hour blocks to like innovate and futz around with stuff, but to help set the expectation that that's the norm and what's expected is really important. So last thing I want to highlight here are blameless postmortems. It's really important. Teams must feel safe as they're doing their work. If people feel scared that they're going to be thrown under a bus because they caused a problem in production, then we'll never be able to happen. We'll never be able to prevent failures from happening again and again. And my guess is if you haven't broken production, I'm going to say this. If you've broken production, raise your hand, right? Like, yes, that's the most hands we've seen all night. Like, most everybody has broken production, and we certainly never showed up to work that day to be like, today's the day. So when we do break production and experience a failure, we have to determine what the factors and decisions leading up to that event that caused the failure. And we have to create an environment where people feel safe talking about that. If we have any kind of a culture of blame, shame, we can't get better and learn from our failures. So if you haven't read John Allspaw's amazing post on it in Etsy's Code is Craft blog, please do. It's very important. Okay, last, and then I'm going to wrap up and take some questions. So some different things to do within the organization to just kind of help create some momentum and make the journey fun. Internal events, so I kind of mentioned those earlier, and that can be, whether it's hackathons across the organization, or it's kind of like a mini, a mini, let's get our groups together that are having some successes and making these changes and give them a podium to stand on for 30 minutes or 20 minutes or something to demo what it is that they're doing and some exciting results that they've been able to push into production. And then lastly, I'd also so internal events, but also just fun in general, having like swag and coming up with like fun little tech slogans and, you know, t-shirts or sweatshirts or socks or who knows what kind of fun things you can come up with. It goes a long way, and you get a lot for it. Participate in your local community. So thank you everybody that's here. Like these types of events are super important. Go to meetups. If your organization doesn't sponsor meetups, maybe kind of push a little bit to see if you can sponsor meetups from either, you know, like purchasing the beverages here, or maybe you just have a specific technology meetup that you sponsor in the venue at your headquarters. It's really important, and I highlight that as well because I think it's really critical that we get outside of the four walls of the organization and the context that we're like in day to day to expand what's going on more broadly across the industry. And we're lucky enough to have a really great tech scene here, so participate. So similarly, encourage the use of leveraging open source and contributing back to it. Talk and participate at conferences like this. Like it's really, really interesting to hear the stories across other organizations and what it is that's going on more broadly. And then, so finally, building a strong technology brand, and maybe it's that swag that you do in those internal events, and there's all sorts of little things that we can do to help build a strong brand within our IT organization. It really makes recruiting and retaining really good folks in the organization a whole lot easier if, you know, when you say, like, hey, I work at XYZ company. I'm going to try and quote, I work at XYZ company. So it's like, oh my God, I heard that's an amazing place, right? Like that makes it, that's the kind of company that we all want to work for. And so do things that help build that brand internally and then externally as well. So that's it. I just covered a lot. I really tried 30 minutes, but I said that I was going to ramble on, and I did ramble on a couple of those slides that I didn't intend to. But I covered a very broad, kind of thin slice on some different topics. Hopefully you heard something that was new, you learned something. If you didn't, maybe you heard a few like, yep, been through that, agree with that. So I guess I'll just wrap it up there, and if you're, maybe one last plug, if you're looking for something really interesting to work on and be part of an impactful journey that we're on in healthcare and Optum Tech, talk to me afterwards, because of course we're hiring.
Thank you so much, Heather.
Yeah, thanks.
I feel like my mic is louder than Heather's. I don't know. Maybe I should have given her this one to hold. But I'm going to, I know that we had at least one question during, and if your question didn't get answered, I would love to have you repeat it just so that we can have it on the audio and we can hear a little bit more about Heather's thoughts on it.
So maybe this is based, so my first question to you is, when did you come to Optum? Had that decision already been made that we're going to DevOps? Or was that something that you had to convince management of?
So the question, I don't know, could folks hear that question? I couldn't. Yeah, can you make it a little? So the question was, when I started at Optum, had that decision already been made at that executive level? Was the support there, or did I have to help influence it? The answer is, when I started at Optum, there was already extreme support at the CIO level, CIO leadership level. The part of the change curve that we're on right now is the scaling across the rest of the organization and kind of bringing like our middle management teams along about what does this change mean. While I was at Target previously, yes, we absolutely had to influence our executive levels in terms of why it was an important change and what a change looked like and why we needed to do it.
So how did you go about doing that?
So how did we go about doing it? So a couple of different ways. So the way I laid out that story has a lot to do with my personal experience. So we started with, there were a handful of engineering teams saying, we can't continue to operate in this waterfall factory delivery model, you know, where we hand off our requirements to an architect, you know, and it goes like this. because we can't move quickly enough. It takes us 8 months to get anything done. So these teams, so we formed some teams that started embracing some of, CI, building our deployment pipelines, and demonstrating results in production. And that's honestly what it was. And doing demos, like we did demos, saying like, watch, push the button, we just deploy. Like, I don't think we did the watch, we just deployed to prod, because you don't want to scare too much right away, right? Like, but look, watch, we just deployed to state, right? Or something like that, right? Like, and look what we can do in 2018. Like, it's different CIO than back when you were doing engineering. It's pretty amazing what we can do these days. And so that's honestly what it was. And of course we had steering committees, and we'd have, put PowerPoints together, and here's all the things, yeah.
I have a similar question. I was working as director of engineering of a big company in the Twin Cities and trying to grow a DevOps group. And I had, software architects, designers, test teams, several different managers, and had a manager of DevOps. But I was regularly having a debate with the CIO, which was more concerned with cybersecurity and keeping things under control than moving fast, and trying to convince him of that. I don't know if you've had any of those things and trying to influence or deal with that kind of debate of moving fast versus being cautious in cybersecurity.
Yeah, I mean, I often have, in having those debates, say we're a lot more secure because we actually have everything that we're doing as code, and we have more of an audit trail. We understand what the changes are. I mean, cybersecurity, I mean, I guess I don't know, like, specifically, as I'm, like, on the spot standing up here in front of everybody. How do you answer that? But I think telling the story of speed doesn't necessarily equal risk. In order to get speed, like, we're driving a lot of automation, and we really understand what it is that we're doing, and we can backtrack. It's not like in a manual that's in somebody's cube that, gets dusted off once a year when we're looking at our, business continuity plans. You have that manual? I don't know, and do others have, I don't know, do others have experience specifically?
I think I was at Target at a similar time frame to you.
Yeah.
And worked, I was at Target at a similar time frame maybe to you, and helped kind of put together a security response or process for all of the 26 development teams to help comply in order to make sure that kind of the website was more secure, right? How many more pages on it. And from my perspective, the biggest thing was partnering with the development teams to figure out the fastest way to be able to support that fast development in a way that was still secure. So we had to work, we worked with White Hat to kind of make sure that they could run the penetration tests in a timely fashion.
Yeah.
We understood the changes that were being made. But I mean, for us, and that was a few years ago, there wasn't a lot of magic to it, but it was more about partnering very closely to say, okay, from a security standpoint, here's what's required.
Yeah.
From a dev standpoint, what's required, and how do those come together to ensure that what gets launched into production is secure.
Yeah, I agree, that partnership between the teams. So, and you sometimes hear like DevSecOps, right? Like bringing, like, security absolutely is part of the change as well. And starting to think about, and I think in many of these different practices, right? Like, what are the actual control? Let's talk about what it is we're trying to do first versus how, right? Because sometimes we jump really quickly to the how, and like, what are the different tools we're going to use, instead of saying like, well, what are these security controls that we're trying to meet? And then let's talk about how we can still meet those controls, but maybe in a different way than we have historically.
Hi. I saw you push the button and then say, boom, we have a deployment, but when we hit...
I mean, it's just magic like that, right?
That was
DevOps.
But when we hit that button, it causes like a 3-day QA cycle of regression, and then we have hot fixes, and then there's another 3 days, and then we have to have a bunch of people sign off in a big, important, scary meeting, and then it goes, out there and it's deployed.
Yeah.
So we have a tweak cycle currently, and we're thinking about going to 4 because of that cost. And so I'm wondering at what point you have this accelerating technology saying we can release on demand versus the costs. I mean, I don't think our customers expect software every 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bank, but
Yeah.
what's the pushback? What's the happy path here? Happy point?
in my opinion, and I'd love to open it up to others. So when I say the move to continuous integration is the biggest change, it's because we've been doing manual QA cycles, and that's how we've done it. And that's often the QA and the testing is longer than our actual dev processes, right? So spending the time to create the tests that we need to have the coverage across our code, it's a lot of time investment up front to get that initial work done and start understanding what that looks like. But that's exactly what I mean. It's like your testing cycles should be repeatable, automated, and kind of help be part of that automated build process. Because otherwise you need the, like I have been there as well, right? Like I talk about manual deployment checklists and like all of that and going to change review boards, and like those were constructs that we created to intentionally slow down our deployment cycles, right? Because every time we put a change in, the aftermath of that was pretty.
So she said something very important in that I don't think you can have the push button unless you have the automated tests built.
Yeah.
So those two go hand in hand. If you do not have those automated tests built, you cannot push the button.
We just need to see that industry average for automated testing.
Sorry, we can go to crosstalk just as soon as we've gotten everyone's individual questions, but can you repeat what was just said for the back of the room?
Yeah, that as I was talking about the magic button. No, I'm sorry. I feel terrible that I did that. The magic button, but so having like being able to deploy quickly on demand assumes that you have automated testing, assumes that you're practicing continuous integration, which means your tests are built into your build and deploy process. Yep. No magic button until that hard work is done.
Before I go to my question, the part before where the security was coming in place, one of the things that happened was with our security team, where they are always concerned about risk, what we were able to offer them was how do we provide some kind of API or OAuth kind of deal where all of our tools can go through those so it's more secure, and have the security team be convinced about it. And that way we're not only streamlining our process where people are not going randomly using same password by 15 developers, but now they have to go through these kind of centralized OAuth, and you can control out of it. Saying that, my question is, as we go more and more towards DevOps, the culture that I'm seeing is there's more and more hands-off for the managers, and it's more and more hands-on for the engineers, so getting away from being a manager, or being a manager that is more of a hands-on manager. How do you see this trend going forward?
Yeah, that's I've been talking about that recently. I have opinions on it. I have a lot of opinions on it. So I've had so I think it has to do there's no cookie cutter recipe for a team. Like I think I laid out what is the primary roles that we have on the team. You're gonna have different people sometimes playing that role on a team. We sometimes use like the self-forming team, that work and like are now high-performing teams. Your engineering, kind of depending on people's strengths on the team, what people like to do, what an engineering manager does on one team is probably very different than what an engineering manager does on another team. I've had teams in the past where once a quarter, because my team's accountable for building more technical products, and so my product owners were actually engineers within the organization. And once a quarter, we'd kind of sit down and go through those primary roles that I had up there and be like, okay, Scrum Master, what are we accountable for? Product Owner, what are we accountable for? Engineering Manager, what is it that we're accountable for? To make sure that we were providing the proper, environment and support for the engineers doing the work. But as well, I think that flat organization and having engineering managers accountable for kind of broad, big teams forces them out of the day-to-day work and to help set and protect, kind of help ensure the team has everything that they need to be successful, but the role of the engineering manager changes. But sometimes you'll have an engineering manager that is playing a senior engineering role as well. So I think it can depend, and I think that's okay.
We've talked about the journey that your teams have been on, from little to no DevOps to being a much more mature organization, and having HR as a partner in that. Has there been a specific change to the employee review process that's gone hand in hand with that?
Yes. Yeah, so I'm gonna, right now, I'm in an organization where it's the more traditional review process. In my prior organization, it was it had shifted from being kind of a more, I recall if I go back, say 7 years in my career, I would spend hours and hours and hours at the annual review cycle and mid-year review cycle. There's no way I could even had more than like 6 direct reports. It was such an intensive process that was then like reviewed by my boss and reviewed by that boss. You know what I mean? Like it's super intense. The trust level, I think, needs to increase, and the constant feedback between, you know, an HR manager and folks on the team I think we see that start to evolve as well, as we kind of become a less, I don't know why, I can't think of a better way to say this right now other than kind of a less formal culture where, you know, like, oh, I'm gonna status with my boss today and here's my written status report and I'm gonna wear a tie and a jacket, to more of like, we're all in the same, you know, like we're all using Slack and chatting back and forth and like part of that flat organization. So like the feedback starts to it's just more natural and we're talking about it. And so I saw review, like HR being a very good partner, kind of saw that as well and how it kind of like streamlined the review process. So it was, of course, and streamlined the way that scores were given as well, right? To make that a lot easier to do as well. I don't know. Not a great. That's what I've seen. I'm not an expert by any means there.
So you talked about the developer. Are there any low-hanging fruits you talk about to get the developer engineers moving faster or taking some of the pressure off the engineers? I mean, you talked about one of the biggest things we have to do is go faster, and I think you alluded to that there's some natural things that we can do for the developers to get them more modernized and so on.
The first thing that I do whenever I start working with a new team is sit down with the broader team and have everybody tell me the top, if you could change 3 to 5 things, what would those 3 to 5 things be? And often you'll hear like, oh, it sucks, this laptop that I have, like I can't do anything on it. Or, you know, like, and that's often the low-hanging fruit. And then starting to talk about, all right, so where are we spending all of our time? Or this maybe even comes up in the conversation of like, what are our biggest 3 to 5 pain points? And if operations and fighting production fires is right up there at the top, I think that's where you say, all right, well, let's capture that, and then we need to sit down and talk specifically about why are we spending all of our time fighting fires in production? Like, what is it that's driving that? So again, like, I think it's very, very important to listen to our folks that are doing the work day in and day out, and have them help us understand what are the biggest barriers to moving quickly and to having fun. I always say as well, what could we change so we're all having more fun? Beer at work is not an option.
Hi. So.
Oh. No, yeah.
Hi. I was brought in to fix an existing broken pipeline that they have put in, that the client has put in. And every time I try to bring up issues with the existing broken pipeline, the vendor who is put in that pipeline says, oh, it's a one-time thing and it can be fixed the next hour or so. And it does get fixed, obviously. I mean, there's nothing in code that you cannot fix. How do you deal, or how should I go ahead and deal with putting a strategy or a vision in place? Currently, there is no vision towards which the team is working. This whole pipeline that was put in for DevOps was like a proof of concept many years ago. And I think today we can revisit that strategy and revise our stuff, because there are so many off-the-shelf products that we can, leverage, and we don't have to depend on so much coding and so much work that they have done. So how do I convince the client and the vendor to get rid of that work that they have done for 3-4 years, which is not fully developed today?
Well, boy, I don't know how to answer that other than, I mean, yeah, there's tools out there that are very, as you said, just kind of like off the shelf and kind of like the standards across the industry. It might be building a POC and demonstrating how quickly something like that can be done, and like retiring and then asking the question of, okay, do we want to spend our time custom building this pipeline around, sounds like some kind of vendor product that's a little wonky? Like, is that where we want to be spending our engineering cycles, or do we want to be spending our engineering cycles over here solving, this business problem that's going to help create value for the organization?
That I'm going to editorialize as I pass the mic and say that is so key. It's like, what are you in the business of actually doing? I'm guessing it's not building pipelines.
Yeah. It's a problem that's been solved.
When you do data centralization, does it require the application of different systems to do some projects to change how they use the data, and how do you go about, that strategy?
Yes. That can be a really long conversation. I'm going to answer it. I'm going to try and answer it though in a minute or less. So I've had the opportunity to approach that, like unlocking our data from two very different starting points. Starting point number one was many years ago, as I mentioned, and I was starting from, I walked into my first steering committee with some of the execs in the IT organization, and on the back of my laptop I had a sticker that said, I heart APIs. And one of the technology leaders looked at my laptop and kind of tilted head and said, I heart appies? What's that? And I thought, oh, okay, so so that was one starting point where we were, where just APIs and an API program and having just access to our data was kind of net new and brand new. And so that's why in that function it was important to centralize, to say, what do we want to start building out? What's most important? How are we going to do this here? What are our standards and best practices? And then on the flip side of the coin, where I'm working currently, we totally got the idea of APIs, and we have thousands of APIs running in production, going after the same core data in different ways, transforming it differently. And so, in this channel over here, we have some data exposed differently than in this channel over here. So in that sense, kind of centralizing and rationalizing and simplifying is very important. And again, kind of pulling those different integration layers together that have been built over time and simplifying. And then, so in both of those cases, yes, consuming applications need to change the way that they're getting the data. Strategy in place that we're using at OptumTech is, let's look at the highest volume APIs, what are the contracts that we have out there that lots of different applications are using, and then let's just kind of shift the back end of those to a more modern architecture so we can get the kind of operational benefits of shifting the architecture. Yeah, the old look over here while we change this over here. And then as we build kind of the net new the foundational or core set of APIs, it'll be as teams are available and making changes, they'll gradually start consuming them. But in the meantime, we'll build this kind of in between so that the switching cost for applications is lower. I don't know if that answered the question. You can ask me again and ask me in a different way if that didn't answer it. Okay.
I have a question. Right next door. So automation. I understand that it is key to continuous integration, and there's lots of different things you can automate and types of tests you can automate. You can do your automated unit testing, you can do automated regression testing. And if you look at Scrum teams that are doing like 2 and 3 week iterations or sprints, you're deploying possibly even during that sprint multiple times, or maybe not, maybe every 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Hopefully, but you're doing a lot. And I'm just wondering, knowing that you can't automate everything, when you say you need to automate in order to have that easy button, you're automating unit testing, you're automating regression testing, and then what's the magic about figuring out in the middle how much of that functional testing do you automate for the features you're building? Or how do you go about even making a judgment call on that?
I mean, I think that is an important role, and it's open it up to others in the room that have an opinion on that as well. I think that's a really important role for a product owner to help decide as well, right? Like, what parts of this is it worth us to automate so that we can do this again and again and again, or what might be kind of some one-off functionality, and I mean, I say that and then I'm going to question myself even as I say that, but you know, could there be cases where it doesn't make sense to build the time to automate something?
I'm basic, whatever you use to characterize a good automation candidate.
Yeah. A good, like, what would be a good automation candidate? Yeah, and I think I honestly think it comes down to what part is it. So if you're introducing a new feature, you know that feature's going to be there, and you want to make sure that you're testing that it works release after release after release. I think it should be something that's automated. Otherwise, you're building up slowly but surely. You're starting to increase your manual testing cycles.
Heather, one company that I was at recently, we had your picture of the pyramid. You know, we had the sort of incubators going. We actually had the CIO who was on board, but they were missing that middle. We couldn't get the middle management layer on board. And I think, and some of them actually knew it was the right thing to do, but I think they were too worried for their jobs.
Yep.
How do you help explain that, you know, there may be roles for all of them, but it's not exactly what they're doing today.
Yeah, I mean, I think bringing the middle along on the journey is important. I think as well we can say, and usually it's accurate, of roles and what it is and how we do our jobs are shifting. Let's talk about how that shift impacts, you know, in this organization, what that means. And if you're totally on board and want to make the change, like, awesome. There is usually a lot more work to do than there are people to do it. I didn't talk about this at all, but so I'll mention it because you just asked the question of, like, I know I need to change, but I don't really know what to do. Like, I hear the words coming out of your mouth, but I don't know how to translate that into my, like, day-to-day work. So I mentioned bringing in, like, coaches to help work alongside the teams. But a couple other things that I've done that have worked. And one was, like, I still remember, it was probably one of my scariest days driving into work. And it was like 4 years ago. And we built an internal conference that was just for middle managers. So it was like, you know, pay grade, whatever and above. So it was like all of my peers plus, which is why it makes it scary. Like, I would much rather stand in front of a group here where there's some familiar faces, but lots of strangers and talk, than stand up in front of my peer group and talk about things. And so it was an internal conference, and we brought in a handful of external speakers from similar industries or the same industry that had gone through journeys and could talk about what the journey looked like for them personally and then within their teams. Because it was then, I think Bridget said it as she was kicking off, right? Of, like, it's cool and good sometimes to, like, talk within your organization, but it's all, right, wrong, or otherwise, it's always a lot more impactful if somebody from a different organization comes in and talks about it and how that changed, what that looked like for them and how they approached it. And the reason why I say it was like a scary thing of, like, it's a bringing a lot of people together for a day-long session, and then we'd have like breakout sessions, but it worked really well, and I wasn't sure if like everybody in that would like walk away and be like, lame use of my time. At the end of the day, almost everybody was like, that was an amazing, 7 hours or 8 hours, however long it was, like learned a ton, gave different ways to start thinking about the change.
All right, we have a question back here.
Hi, my name is. So I was wondering, is a DevOps is a kind of a at this point, or is that go away in very future? Because I still see a lot of systems built on waterfall. They're amazing. There's still a lot of them are successful, standing there.
Yeah.
Ever broken? No. But DevOps or any other like Agile and all, people are. So we cannot get up, right? Involved with the process. Are involved, so does their rates and all that stuff. So these are approaches. Think anything in near future take over DevOps?
I am certain that 5 years from now we won't be standing here talking about DevOps. I mean, maybe we will be, but I think it'll just be kind of like the way we do our work, and there'll be some other like new interesting thing that we're talking about to continuously improve and just get better at how it is that we're building software and building our systems. Yes, there will be people involved for the foreseeable future. And I think it's a lot more interesting. Like if it is something that we can automate and like make repeatable and like press those magic buttons. I'm sorry, I already said that. But you know what I mean? Like if it's something that's repeatable and we kind of know what it is and we can create a checklist for it, well, if we can create a checklist for it, let's find a way to automate it so that we can work on something that's more interesting and a more challenging problem to solve. Right? Like I hate when things break in production. Like that's not interesting or exciting, right? Like so if whoever figures out a way to fix that, no, I'm kidding. But yeah, let's focus on like building new features and like trying out new products and like move quickly and see like what resonates with, whatever the market is for the company that we work for.
All right, wow. So I think when the Q&A is almost as long as the talk, that's a sign that everyone wants to be talking about this stuff. This is fantastic. So let's have one more round of applause for Heather.